Hello and welcome to Mapping the Master Plan. Today's guest is Judi Barrett. If you saw the previous housing show, we talked a little about Judi, so I won't go into all the particulars, but Judi is the Director of Municipal Services for RKG Associates. Prior to that, she was the Director of, for the planning for the Community Opportunity Group, who wrote our Affordable Housing Plan. She is a professor and an author. She did, in fact, write recently authored a new chapter for the 40B Guidebook for the Mass Housing Partnership, 40B being the state law that deals with affordable housing. As far as I know, she is not the author of Cloudy with a Chance of Meatballs.
Thank you.
That is a different Judi Barrett, who's much easier to find on the internet, by the way. And Judi has an immense level of skills that she brings to the town, to the housing. She's familiar with Kingston, having worked here on our affordable housing plan, worked here on the fiscal analysis for 40R. And one of the things out of our affordable housing plan that she mentioned to us, sorry about the reach, one of her primary recommendations in the affordable housing plan, Good Neighbors, was an affordable housing trust. And so now, after a series of fits and starts, the town has created an affordable housing trust.
That's great.
We went to the training they held in Worcester, December 9th.
Mm-hmm. Jen and Sherry, I think, probably did it. Yeah,
Jen
Goldson.
Jen Goldson.
Yep.
Was speaking there. She's also been to a community preservation committee meeting here in Kingston to talk about services they can provide to help support affordable housing and help support the Affordable Housing Trust. So we've got a trust, we're working on trust documents. We've met with town council. We are very excited about moving the ball on affordable housing. They have an application in to the Community Preservation Committee for some startup funding, and they're working through that now. Mm-hmm. So we look at the Affordable Housing Trust, and there are a number of things that come with that. This is the big packet of stuff you get from a Mass Housing Partnership. And in it, and I don't have the pretty copy one, it talks about Municipal Housing Trust. Mm-hmm. There's an operations manual for that. We in the planning office will be writing some staffing for them to help with some of the bookkeeping things, because there's a number of bookkeeping issues with that. So now that we have an affordable housing trust, what do we do? Do we want to go out there and try to build a 100-unit development and create affordable housing en masse, or what do we typically see from Affordable Housing Trust in communities similar to Kingston? You've worked in how many communities? All of them?
167.
Only 167 out of 351, so not all of them.
Right.
So we have Affordable Housing Trust, and so what are those things you would typically see a trust looking at and trying to create in a town comparable to Kingston?
Yeah. Well, I think every housing trust, before they decide to take their money and start spending it, they need a plan for the trust, which is a little different from the housing plan for a town. An affordable housing plan that I worked on with you a few years ago is really, it's a needs assessment. It's kind of what can the town as a whole do. A trust would be a piece of that. But there are lots of actions in a housing plan that go on without a trust. So a trust has a specific role. It can be a developer, it can be a financing agent, it can be a catalyst for pre-development support. But what it is an entity that, assuming you haven't created some barriers to its ability to function, it can be almost as nimble as a private developer. And that's really what communities needed before the legislation was passed that allowed the creation of housing trusts. Because housing trusts can, if they have resources available to them, engage in real estate acquisition and development. They also can be partners with for-profit and nonprofit developers for the creation of affordable housing. If they're using CPA funds to do that, then they always have to be mindful of the opportunities and limitations for the use of CPA. Other funds, such as funds that might come through under an inclusionary housing bylaw, don't necessarily have the same restrictions. So you always have to kind of understand the mechanics of, we're a funding source. We're as a trust, we're basically a funding source. And how do we sort of make sure we comply with all the requirements of the various sources that we are administering? So I think having a plan for the trust is really key, and there's a couple of types of plans. My colleague Jen, who does a lot of work with housing trusts around the state, often does what's called a housing action plan, and it's really around what is this trust going to try to do in the next 5 years. So if you have a housing production plan, like the one I worked on with you, that lays out what the community as a whole, with its internally and also with developers, will be trying to do over 5 years. A trust might be doing a piece of that plan. So the 5-year plan for the trust is about what is this trust going to do, and that's really a function of what kinds of needs does this trust want to try to address? What is its interest level? What's its capacity? A lot of trusts in Massachusetts have trouble getting going because they're very interested in affordable housing and they want to do something, but they don't necessarily know how to move forward. So having an action plan helps them do a roadmap, if you will, for how do we go from, gee, we've got this trust, this is great, to actually being able to do something. But their roles can vary. Under the statute, they have very broad latitude. And I would just point out that although having affordable housing developed under Chapter 40B or your local zoning brings with it a kind of deed restriction to protect the affordability of units as they are resold or rented over time, there's probably nothing as powerful as having a mortgage. And so a housing trust, being able to participate as a financing source in someone else's affordable housing development, can be an invaluable enforcement tool.
And can you explain, because I didn't quite follow it, so they would hold the mortgage, so can you fill me in on how that
Yeah, in non-compliance, you foreclose.
Okay.
I mean, I hate to say it, but I mean, they really have the ability to exercise authority that that normally a town would not have. So they may not want to do that, but I'm just saying they would have that power. But I think the other thing that's valuable for trusts is that if you have a business plan for how you're going to manage the fund, there's sort of a plan for what do we want to do as a trust and how do we build capacity over time so we can become effective agents of affordable housing development. But the other thing is, how do we manage this fund that we have a fiduciary responsibility for? How do we manage this fund so we don't, whiffle it down to nothing on a series of projects that may not be meeting as many needs as we have in the community? So it's not all that common in Massachusetts with housing trusts because they're too new. But if you look back over the history of economic development corporations created by communities that managed business loan funds, it's very common to have a business plan for a fund. And the business plan establishes things like how much of the principal that we have at any given time do we want to put into buying down existing houses? That's a nice strategy. It's expensive per unit. But that's something that communities do. How much of this fund do we want to invest in income-generating development? So maybe we are a low-interest source of financing for someone else's affordable housing project. We invest in it. We get some payback. How much do we want to put into projects where we're essentially a source of what I call patient capital, which is we'll give you a loan, but you don't have to pay it back as long as you provide a certain number of units in your development for very low-income people. There's a lot of ways a housing trust can engage in development, and I think that really we have to start with where are their interests, what's their capacity, and what do they need to do to ramp up to having capacity to make those more sophisticated judgments about
so having
how to be
that
effective.
5-year action plan
is a very important step.
To talk about what we want to do, and then a business plan to look at how much money do we have and where do we want to spend that money at.
That's what I think, yeah.
Now, as we talked about, an affordable housing trust is more nimble because you don't have to go to town meeting.
Right.
A few years back when we had the market was in dire straits, there were a lot of very depressed properties. An effective functioning affordable housing trust at that point could have perhaps picked up some of these properties, rehabbed them and sold them with an affordable housing rider on it and created affordable housing without having to go to town meeting and say 17 Noniac Street is for sale, let's go try to buy it. Right. So that is sort of that nimbleness that comes with a trust. You've got this funding source, and maybe every year the trust goes back to the CPC and goes back to town meeting and says, we want another X number of dollars to fund the next year's project, because this is what we've got on our action plan, and this is what we've looked at here as far as where we want to spend our money at.
Yeah. Well, I think one of the things you want to look at too is what is the relationship between the Affordable Housing Trust and the Community Preservation Committee? Because you've got a couple of ways you can go. You know, town meeting can appropriate in response to the recommendation of the Community Preservation Committee X amount of money for housing. Does it stay with the CPC or does it transfer over to the trust? Does the trust essentially build up a reserve, or do they have to go to the CPC when they want to access those funds? So I think some of that relationship building is important. It's been an issue in some towns.
And I'm going to guess, because we are new to this, there's going to be sort of a slower rollout.
Might be.
If the Affordable Housing Trust goes to the CPC and says, you got $600,000, we want it all to get started. You might find a town or a committee that says, well, maybe we don't want to start off like that. Maybe we want to give you a trial run. You know, here's half that. Here's 300. Let's see how you do, and we'll come back next year and report back on how things are going and what your plans are for the next year.
That's not an uncommon approach. The problem, of course, for the trust is if $300,000 isn't enough to really do something meaningful, then they may come back the next year and say, we need another $300,000. We're banking essentially what we have now, but here's our business plan. Here's what we're actually striving to do. This is the amount of reserve we're trying to build so that we can actually do the following kinds of projects. And as I said, I think it's a relationship building issue. Some CPCs, community preservation committees, are really happy to have a housing trust to just take the affordable housing issue off their backs, because so often CPCs, who also have the best interest of the town at heart, may know a lot about open space acquisition and or historic preservation, may not so much about housing development. And for many of them, it's not really their mission. So having an entity that's competent to do housing can be really advantageous to a CPC.
Actually, we know the community preservation committees get a lot of requests for open space, a lot of requests for historic preservation, requests for recreation, but that, and no offense to any stepchildren, that affordable housing component really is sort of the stepchild of the CPC. We love to do something, but we just don't know quite.
It's hard. It's hard. I mean, in some communities, housing is a big piece of Community Preservation Act allocation, but in others it's not. And sometimes it's not simply because there's no entity to do something with it. And there's not an entity to sort of advocate for housing acquisition or investment. So again, that's a role the trust can play, is being that entity that can say, we can take this problem off your back and we can do affordable housing development with this funding.
And we sort of look at trying to maximize those funds available. You know, one of the strategies is that the town could build affordable housing. And with that becomes prevailing wages and all those sort of things that in Massachusetts.
You don't want to go there, Tom.
They tend to drive up the cost
That's right.
of something you're trying to make affordable for
right.
people.
You don't want to do that.
So another strategy is that they could do an RFP for a developer.
Request for proposals. Did you want me to do that,
Oh,
Bell,
thank
now?
you. Yes, thank you. You were bell worthy. You may think on that. So a request for proposals for developers. But the trouble in Kingston, like other towns, is most of the land that we own was bought for a particular purpose. We've been through the book so many times, the pages are afraid looking for a space that maybe Habitat wants or somebody else for affordable. And we've got a couple, potential properties.
But you may have lots that are privately owned that are substandard, not developable. You could think about the possibility through zoning change to make small lots available for development if the use is affordable housing. And now what you've at least done is created a land base for small-scale development on an infill basis. It costs more to build an affordable unit than it does to ever recoup from selling it. So it isn't going to open up a mass of for-profit developers coming in and saying, oh, we're going to put houses all over your town. But it creates a land base for nonprofit entities and the housing trust to be able to do some small-scale development. So it may not be even acquiring the land as much as just making some land available that already exists, but for zoning it would be usable.
And in Massachusetts, things are different. One of our speakers of the House who was being hauled off to jail once said, just because the other 49 states do it wrong doesn't mean Massachusetts has to.
Yeah.
So we have our own perspective on how we do things.
Yes, we do.
When we look at, and once again, I totally lost my train of thought on this. When we look at trying to create those developments, one of the tools that we use to get into the weeds, and you can ring the bell, are LIPs and LAUs. Local initiative program,
And
where the
local action
town and local action is where the town sponsors the development of affordable housing on a
Right.
piece of property.
Right.
It's sort of, some people will call it a friendly 40B. We're applying to those same sort of folks to say, well, this property isn't zone necessary for that or for this density. We want to do this local initiative program and create these affordable units. Even though the zoning says this parcel is for one unit, you might be able through a LIP put a 4-bedroom building on it or something like that. So those are one of the tools available without having to go through rezoning a lot of things, although as we talked about earlier, one of the products that following the master plan is looking at rezoning things.
Yeah.
You suggested some things in the affordable housing plan about rezoning strategies for housing as well, and all those things that we're kind of putting on the track. So we took a trip to Marshfield recently and met Jack Mather, who is just fabulous, about what their affordable housing partnership is doing there.
Yep.
And buying down properties and providing this support. So that is not a very fast, not a very glitzy strategy, but it's creating affordable units.
Absolutely. And I wouldn't ever knock that. My only comment is that on a per unit basis, it's a pricey way to do affordable housing. But it's a strategy that many communities have used. If you have older stock and you don't want to lose it to tear downs or whatever, buy it, bring it to code, and resell it as an affordable unit. It's done.
And what you've lost is the difference between the cost of the unit at market price and the cost that you're reselling it at.
Right.
And
that's the subsidy.
Correct. And that affordable housing restriction, that deed runs with the house.
Yes, it does.
And so typically they're 20-year deed riders, some longer, because there's
many of them are perpetual.
Well, and I don't want to get into the rule of perpetuity,
Yeah, right.
which is way in the weeds as far as.
Yeah, we're not doing that.
Yeah, you'd have to
Where's
ring the
that
bell.
bell?
You'd have to ring the bell for days. So providing that housing stock and
Yeah.
creating those sort of things. So the trust can buy real estate, they can develop real estate, they can help fund other organizations. But it's important to take that step and look at creating the action plan.
I really think it is, because it'll give them a roadmap. I mean, every new entity especially an entity that has money that it's responsible for, you need a roadmap so you kind of know how to make choices. You can have lots of opportunities to do affordable housing, but you can't do them all. If you have, $1 million in your trust fund and you have requests for $3 million worth of affordable housing activity, how do you pick the one that's going to get you the greatest outcome for your community? Having that roadmap, I think, helps trusts make those decisions.
Now, it's conceivable that we're going to bring somebody like Jen on or something like that to help with that roadmap. Because I'm guessing that sort of finding your own way, creating a map while you're sort of not where you're going is probably a hard thing. So that's not a bad move, bringing on somebody like
Absolutely.
Like them to help with that.
Yep.
And of course, you're using other people's funds, so there's very stringent fiscal requirements to make sure you're documenting all that sort of stuff.
Right.
And that's where our office, the planning office, is all volunteered to help with sort of running those numbers and keeping those books and things like that.
That's a good idea.
So where we're looking at a particular piece of property that we may own, maybe it's a couple acres or something like that, our probably best strategy is doing a request for proposals to developers with what we're looking at getting out of it.
Right. And I'm going to make a recommendation. Before you put a request for proposals on the street, talk to some developers. Some of these projects that are well-intended, that involve an RFP for land the town owns, it wants to make available for housing, have great ideas and they're not realistic. And so it's a good idea, even if it's not about a specific property, but just having a conversation with some developers who know what they're doing can be really helpful to the trust in thinking about what's a realistic ask. If I ask for this, is it likely that I'm going to get it? They should know that before they put an RFP on the street. And I would say, you probably are aware of this, but Massachusetts Housing Partnership, for no charge, will help communities prepare requests for proposals for development on town-owned land. They do that all over the state.
Very nice.
Yeah.
Because the last thing you want to do is have a party nobody comes to.
That's right.
You have an RFP, a request for proposals. You want to know what the marketplace is looking for to make sure that you're actually creating some interest and people are going to.
And as a subsidy agency, whatever it may be, are going to be interested in this project. So having an entity like MHP, Mass Housing Partnership, available can be really helpful. I shouldn't be selling their services for free, but I know they do a lot of this work all over the state.
Well, in addition, Mass Housing Partnership, since we're, because I want to make sure that, RKG gets a pitch. So we'll make a pitch for Mass Housing Partnership as well, is that they also provide services to the Zoning Board of Appeals as they're working with 40B developments.
That's what I do.
To help them steer through that.
Yeah.
We haven't really had a significant 40B in town for a while. We have, most of the members of the ZBA will be sort of new to this. We know we have one on the horizon, a 32-unit development off of South Street that should connect to Tall Timbers Phase 4, but doesn't yet, but we'll be pushing for that. So Mass Housing Partnership can help with RFPs. They can help with services for your ZBA to help steer through 40B.
Yep.
In addition to the services the town council would provide. They're not replacing town council or anything like that. No, it's just you have someone there to help the Board of Appeals with the procedures and just managing the process. I mean, a lot of what's involved, you certainly want to have town council involved if you think litigation is coming, but you don't necessarily need town council there for every single hearing. That's a local decision that has to be made, but Mass Housing Partnership does provide grants to communities to have a consultant help, and it often makes a big difference. The boards don't do 40Bs that often, so we've had a couple of tragic situations in Massachusetts in the last few years where a Board of Appeals, so used to dealing with special permits, got a comprehensive permit application and thought, okay, I have 65 days to open the public hearing, so we'll schedule it on X date, because that's usually what a Board of Appeals deals with. Well, with Chapter 40B, you have to open that hearing in 30 days. And if you don't, the applicant gets what's called constructive approval. Well, so you need help, I guess is the point. And so don't be afraid to ask for it if you actually get a comprehensive permit coming through the door. And I know you don't work specifically with a lot of trusts directly or partnerships, but do you have sort of a heartwarming, and I'm putting you on the spot here, a heartwarming story of a small town like Kingston through their trust or through their partnership where they sort of really nailed using those sort of mechanisms? I can think of two great stories, and I'll try to keep it brief. One is, of course, the town of Easton has a well-known Chapter 40B development there that involved preservation of a mill that was going to be torn down. And with their CPA funds through their housing trust, they not only provided funding for the development, but they used resources to provide the infrastructure to make that renovation possible. And so the Shovel Shop Village is preserved as both a historic preservation and a housing project because that town was proactive. The town of Lincoln's housing trust has used CPA funds to create 2 group homes. And that's a situation where you really are grateful that people don't have to go to town meeting, because you can't have a debate on town meeting floor about where a group home for people with disabilities is going to be located. So they've done it twice. And of course, group home units, each room counts as a unit for Chapter 40B purposes. So Lincoln got 10 or 12 units on the subsidized housing inventory just by using through their trust, providing funds for group home development. And that's a couple of good examples, because they're 2 very different places. Lincoln, it's hard to say, here, we'll do what Lincoln did, because they have resources that most of us won't have. Just for the affluence. For the most part, it's their community preservation funds that they're using. They don't have all that much. And Easton is also, sort of alleged to be, I shouldn't say, but alleged to be a sort of tough town to try to get things done in. But in the old Hames Shovel Shop, a great historic building in their town. Fabulous project. And credit to a very visionary town administrator for making that happen. Excellent. Well, so these things happen. There are success stories. You just got to make your plan, look at your money,
Yep.
And move forward to make sure that you got sort of a sustainable plan for the trust.
Right.
And will we make it to 10%? Probably not.
I don't think it's the issue.
Is it important? For some, but for the most part, the issue is creating affordable units, creating
Right.
places for people in their communities to downsize to so they can stay in those communities,
Yep.
creating those units that aren't available presently, and moving forward to have control over your town versus having the state
Someone
or
else
some other
wag that,
developer
yep.
to say, here's
Yep.
what we're going to do to you, for you, to help you meet this need.
Yeah.
So once again, Judi, thank you very much for coming
you.
in. I know you're an immensely busy woman with just with your day job, not to mention all your other activities. So I'm happy to have you here. Thank you very much.
I'm happy to be here. Always happy to help out the town of Kingston.
Take care, Judi. Thank
Yep,
you.
Thank you.